This is just a test 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, modulating different levels of my voice. And then if I bring it back down and I'm a little bit quieter here, bringing my voice way down, way down, way down. What if I bring the microphone a little bit closer now, 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 a little bit closer now. How's that? Even very, 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 very quiet right here. And now back to a medium voice, medium length, not too far away, not too close. Pretty much, I'd say about 6 to 8 inches away from my face. And if I pick up my voice a little bit, now I see it's going into the red a little bit, and move the microphone a little further away. If I bring my voice back down, I can bring the microphone closer like this. We'll just give that a try. Okay. Welcome to So-Called Discoveries, where we discuss stories, knowledge, and insights from somewhere and try to learn something. My name is Anthony Ozzie. Thank you so much for joining me in the first episode. However it is you found your way here, just know I appreciate your time and I don't take it for granted. In this first episode, don't expect it to be too long or anything, just a little bit casual. I want to just talk about what it is I want to do with this podcast and what it is you can expect to see from it in the future. I mentioned at the top that my hope is that we can learn something through the podcast. We're fortunate to live in a time in which knowledge and information is extremely abundant, but at the same time, it can be somewhat overwhelming. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of information. There's so many different sources of information and knowledge that come out every single day, let alone the things that have come out over the past hundreds or thousands of years through writing, through books, through whatever it might be. I'm certainly someone who's passionate about learning and improvement and trying to always do my best to be the best that I can be and expanding the capacity of what the best that I can be is. And a great way to do that is through reading and through discovery of knowledge and the experience of others and insights that you can gain through that. One big accelerant for me in that aspect of my life has been podcasts. I started listening to podcasts around 2015. I didn't really know what they were before that, but I stumbled across one and got really into it. The first podcast I ever listened to was WTF with Mark Maron. Mark Maron is a comedian. He has a pretty large podcast. That was the first one I ever listened to. He just does interviews with other comedians and actors and various celebrities. And I thought it was just really interesting because the only other celebrity interviews I had seen before that were on late shows or Tonight Show or like stuff like that, just like little quick interviews like that. And it was cool to actually, like, if somebody was interesting, like a famous person, like if they actually were like interesting and they had interesting ideas and they had a great story or anything like that. So it was like something that I'd never seen before, in which you got to like really dig into like just like having a normal person conversation with them and like being able to sit in on that. And so from there, I listened to a few episodes of that, and the second podcast that I listened to was a podcast called Startup, and that came from a company called Gimlet Media, which a few years later, after they came out with that first podcast, they ended up getting purchased by Spotify. So now they're part of Spotify. But at the time, they were independent, and the podcast Startup was essentially, it was sort of a meta podcast. It was a podcast about them starting a podcasting company. I recommend that to anybody who's interested in, I'd say, podcasting or entrepreneurship in general. It's a pretty great podcast. But that's how I got into it. And it was ever since then, I've been, I guess, a bit of a power consumer of podcasts. I listen to quite a lot of podcasts, and I spend a decent amount of time, deciding how I'm going to listen to my podcasts. I often structure up a queue of maybe like 40 hours of podcasts to listen to in a particular order, and I make my way through that queue. And it's not, obviously it's not the same podcast. It's a mixture of different podcasts, but I actually pick the order. It's honestly, sometimes it's a little insane, but I make this huge queue of podcasts for myself, and then I feel a great sense of satisfaction when I make my way through it. And because the medium has been so important and beneficial to me and my learning and development and my exposure and my view and perspective, I felt that it was a medium that I wanted to explore from the creator side. So with that context, with that background, what I really hope to accomplish from this podcast is, one, for myself to continue my own learning and my own development and to follow my own curiosities and to have a system and a motive for following through on that consistently. And then a broader goal beyond just me individually, but like sort of a we goal. I want to offer other people what I have been able to and continue to gain from the vast ecosystem of podcasts that currently exist. And I think that the best way that I can create value for a potential audience is for me to do the heavy lifting, doing research into topics and various issues and subject matters, and doing the hard work of analyzing them and breaking them down and doing the research and repackaging these concepts and putting them together in a new package of a podcast that allows you to digest that information through a little bit more of a compact lens. And my goal is always going to try to be to bring things down to a practical level, like how can we change our behavior? How can we improve? Beyond me doing research and discovery into subjects like that, which will come from books or various other sources of information, I hope to also feature conversations between myself and other people discussing some of these topics that I'll be researching, but also just digging into their stories and backgrounds. I've always been a huge fan of stories and storytelling, and so I want to definitely weave a certain element of that into this podcast. Speaking of the podcast, let me explain a little bit about the name, So-Called Discoveries. I came up with the name because I wanted something that portrayed that, yes, we were going to have an attitude of discovery, and we were going to be seeking and pursuing knowledge and to learn and to be better, and that's what we're going after. But as far as I can anticipate, none of the topics, none of the things we're going to be discussing, none of the sources of knowledge I'll be pulling from to put these episodes together, none of that's going to be hard to access, hard to find, secret, hidden stuff. It's all going to be fairly accessible things. Anybody can get a book for $12 or something like that, or knowledge from the internet. It's going to be things that are accessible, but because we have so many options, because the sources of information is so vast and so deep, there's essentially an infinite possibility of highly accessible information. So saying that it's a so-called discovery, it's like, yeah, it's a discovery, but I mean, not really. It's likely that some of you might already be familiar with some of the concepts, at least slightly. But even if you're not, anything that we're discussing, anything that has come across my radar that I've dug into and done the research into and repackaged and made digestible in this format for you all, you can rest assured that many people have had access to that same information. So yeah, it's that. And then it's also, I wanted to name it that, the so-called, just to have maybe a slight touch of self-deprecation, in the sense that the things that we're going to be discussing in these coming up episodes, and I'm going to tell you what the first real episode, which is going to technically be episode 2, I'm going to tell you what's in that episode in just a moment. But I want to be clear that the knowledge that I'm transferring, the things that I'm going to be discussing, the ideas and the concepts, a lot of it, if not most of it, they're not my ideas. They're not things that I came up with. Like I said, it's things that I looked into, things that I researched. If I'm discussing a book, which is what the first real episode, aka episode 2, is going to be about, if I'm discussing practices from a book and I'm explaining them and giving examples and talking about them, it's because I've studied those concepts that were fleshed out in the book. And the book has been critically acclaimed by many people, and that's why it came across my plate in the first place, and I dug into it and I decided to formulate an episode about it. So I'm talking about the ideas, I'm explaining the ideas. I think the ideas are important and relevant, and in many cases I've incorporated those ideas into my own life, into my own behavior, but they're not originally my ideas. So the so-called is probably meant to have a little bit of a self-deprecating aspect in there too. So now that I've gone over the name, the first meaty episode of this podcast, So-Called Discoveries, aka episode 2, aka the next episode, is going to be about a book called The Effective Executive, subtitle, The Definitive Guide to Getting the Right Things Done. It was originally published in 1967. It was written by Peter F. Drucker, and it is very critically acclaimed. Harvard Business Review says, his writings are landmarks of the managerial profession. Wow. Yeah, but it's praised by a lot of people. If you know who Tim Ferriss is, it's praised by him. He's a very popular podcaster. But many people, not just him, many successful people have praised it, and it is an older book. And older books that still have a lot of modern current praise are things that always catch my attention. Whenever I find that highly successful people talking about a book that was published a long time ago, and I hear even just one, but if I hear more than one highly successful person talk about an old book and say that it was important, I tend to pay high attention to that. Because books that were written a long time ago, they stood the test of time, and successful people today still talk about them, it means that that book actually has something of value. Because a lot of people publish books today, and a lot of them are published in this internet digital information age era, and the idea of like just trying to promote it and publish it and get a lot of sales real quick and get a spike and boost your popularity and do a circuit of promotion and all of these things. It's different than how it used to be for example, when this book was published in 1967. But the book goes over topics like time management and prioritizing and understanding and focusing and building on your strengths. And it's really structured as a business management book to help people that work in knowledge organizations. But even though it's written that way, the principles in there relate to effectiveness as an individual, and that applies to everybody. And that's about work, but it's a lot more than that. It's about being effective as an individual. That episode is going to be a knowledge-heavy episode discussing those principles and those topics and examples. Anyways, I didn't want this episode to be too long because I just wanted to have this be sort of an introduction to me and the podcast and what I was sort of thinking, just sort of setting you off in the right direction. And the first real meaty episode, like I said, is episode 2, the next one. And it is a discussion on the effective executive. So please check it out. I look forward to hearing your feedback and engaging with you if you are interested in it. And if you're still here at this point, thank you again. Like I said, I don't take your time for granted and hope to always be able to provide value or, at the very least, some sort of entertainment or positivity. I want to end with a quote for this first episode. This is not necessarily going to be something that I'm going to do on every episode or even on a regular basis, but at least for this episode today, I felt like I wanted to end with a quote. And that quote is the following. The realization that life is absurd cannot be an end, but only a beginning. That quote is attributed to, he's French, so I'll say his name with a French accent. That quote is attributed to Albert Camus. Or if I was to pronounce it phonetically in American English, I would say Albert Camus, Camus. I don't know him that well, but that's a quote that I came across at some point and I jotted it down, and I felt like I wanted to share that with you guys today to close out the episode. Thank you again. This has been the inaugural episode of So-Called Discoveries, hosted by yours truly, Anthony Ozzie. I hope you tune in to episode 2, and I hope that you learn something.